Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Today we will be going over the second chapter in our textbook, Sources of Information and Why Research is Best and How to Find It. Both chapters 1 and 2 are preparing you before we get into the actual types of research, what the variables are, the different ways of evaluating them, and just really concentrating on understanding the difference between scientific evidence and things that people just kind of say. So, um, it's hopefully easier for you after these two chapters to really understand the heart of where real information comes from and how we can disseminate it or tell it apart from things that are just made up or, as certain people might say, fake news. Both chapters 1 and 2 will prepare you, hopefully, a little more for the first discussion that will be due soon. You can start it after this chapter if you want to, or, closer to the due date. But it's really important to understand why scientific information is the best and why we can't just go basing things on our own opinion and things like that. Psychology is a science because we need to explain our everyday behaviors and explain our theories with scientific evidence, as opposed to just taking our word for it. Remember that in the last chapter, I spent a lot of time going over this hypothetical example of studying. If we were to just listen to what everybody says and not know for ourselves, how do we know that we're not just repeating something that was rhetoric or something that just people just think without actually seeing evidence for? We can't base things on that. So in this chapter, actually, there's not really much about the objectives for this chapter, so I apologize. But basically, we're going to look at people's personal experiences, which a lot of people report on. And it's not that your personal experience is wrong necessarily, it's just biased because if you don't know much about the topic of perception, people's perceptions and the way that they take things is based on your own experiences, expectations, memories, things that you heard growing up. So it's very easy in a household for you to be biased towards what your parents believed or other people around you, and to not actually know if that information is credible or not. But when we do research using that scientific method, the theory data cycle, all of that stuff, it's much easier to say we did this objectively. We didn't have a bias. We looked at the empirical evidence and we saw what the results gave us. So they're very believable. Our own experience can be very biased. At the very beginning, the very end of the lecture last time, I talked about this silly example that seemed to make little sense. That if somebody went to the beach for the very first time and went in the water and got stung by a jellyfish, that they would claim that if you go to the beach, you're going to get stung by a jellyfish. And that argument seemed pretty silly, I would imagine, right? Even if you didn't think much about it after the lecture. Well, that is, in a sense, the same argument as the vaccination or the anti-vax claim. But we'll get back to that. So in this chapter, we're going to look at what the research says versus somebody's own experience and why that might be biased and not reliable. The research versus your intuition. In Psych 1, when I teach that class, I talk about why we can't use our intuition. So how our own intuition, human thinking, is faulty. And even though it may be reliable more often than not, you can't use your own intuition to be able to predict scientific theories and things like that. We're going to talk about trusting authorities on the subject, which people that are in an authoritative spot are the ones that you can actually rely on, and which ones maybe not so much. And then finally, we're going to go with finding and actually reading the research to see what it does and what it says. and why, overall, the research is much better than anybody's opinion or anybody's experience alone. So here is a nice little flowchart, which looks a little boxy because it is, but if you let me take you through this, I will explain it very simply. So right there at the top in green, it says, "This I believe." So these are reasons for you to believe what a person is saying or where information is coming from. You're able to believe it. So it could be that you believe it based on your own experiences. Well, there's two issues with your own experiences. For one, when I went over that example of a scientific experiment using the studying versus not studying, one of the things to make it fair and to make it objective is that you have one group that studies and another group that does not study, so you can make a direct comparison. Here, with your personal experience, you have no comparison group. What happened to you happened to you. If you ate something and got a bad reaction to it, was that bad reaction because of the food? You can't compare it to somebody who didn't eat it. So first of all, your experience has no comparison group. Second of all, there are confounds. One of the other things that I pointed out in that original example from chapter 1 is that maybe studying didn't work, or not studying worked a little better than we thought because, there were problems there. Other variables that could have accounted for the score. Those are known as confounds. Anything else that can sort of explain the relationship or that A causes B. So again, we talk about A causes B, right? In this case, studying causes you to do better on an exam. Confounds could be things like lack of sleep. Confounds could be taking caffeine or other substances. Confounds could be being sick on the day of the exam. Confounds could be some people eating a nice healthy oatmeal for breakfast and some people eating no breakfast or just having pixie sticks, right? Or donuts. That could have an effect. So your personal experience, you can't control for these things. In a research setting, one of the things that we talk about is being able to control for these extra variables or confounds. So based on your own experience or somebody's own experience, you have to understand as a good consumer of research, there's no comparison group and there's confounds. Here it says, "This I believe," based on somebody's intuition. Intuition is biased by two things, or can be biased by two main things: faulty thinking and motivation. Being able to trust your intuition is a nice comforting thing for you, but in the scientific world, it doesn't cut the mustard. So think about this. I like using this example as well. Let's say, since, ELAC campus is really close to downtown LA, and downtown LA has what I would say is probably the most or the biggest homeless population in one concentrated area, probably in the country, per capita. So you're, going through downtown LA, whether you're walking, riding a scooter, biking, taking public transportation, and you see a person that is wearing clothes that are dirty and have holes in them, and the person looks like they haven't showered at least in a day, and they're walking down the street kind of talking to themselves. Your first instinct, based on your intuition, is that person is homeless and very likely has some sort of mental illness like schizophrenia, some sort of diagnosed or undiagnosed mental illness. And you know what? Most of the time, based on the situation where you are, may be true. But let's just say that this one time in particular is that this person actually has a really nice job. It's their day off. And on their day off, they don't want to do anything. And so they're in their most comfortable clothes from many years ago. So comfortable that the clothing is holy, meaning full of holes, not religiously holy. And they are very comfortable. Sweats with holes and shirts that are old and stained and just really comfy. And why not? This person deserves it on their day off. And then they realize that they need something from the store. and it's a 2-block walk over to Ralph's in downtown LA. Their parking spot's good. There's no reason to park 2 blocks down. So this person decides they're going to walk. And as soon as they leave the house and get about halfway to Ralph's, they realize, crap, I forgot my phone at home. And so they could walk back to get the phone, or they can just, walk the rest of the way to Ralph's, grab the stuff they need, and be home before they even have to think about it. So at this point, the person is trying to remember what was on their list of the few things to get from the store. Maybe deodorant, maybe some soda, maybe a protein bar, whatever it is. And so because they don't have their phone, which had their list on it, I know that's how I do things. I take the list with me on my phone, makes it easier. They are trying to use their working memory to remember their list. So how do we do that? We repeat to ourselves. So this person seemingly is talking to themselves in their very comfortable clothes as they're walking down the street. Milk, butter, deodorant, protein bar. What else was there? And you're walking, driving, scooting by at that moment and see them doing this, talking to themselves, but you can't hear what they're saying. Clothes that make them look like they may not have a place to stay. And your intuition says homeless and schizophrenic or mental illness. And in this exact case, you'd absolutely be wrong. And you can't let your faulty thinking, because your intuition leads you that way, to tell you that. So it also may be biased by motivation. People have motivations to say certain things and do certain things. The president will repeat something that he hears and basically, goes by this idea of if you repeat it enough, people will believe it or it makes it real. And that's how a lot of this fake news crap started. It's biased by people's own motivation. And sometimes they don't even realize their own motivation. So to say this, I believe, based on experience, not a great idea. To say this is what I believe based on intuition, again, is a faulty way of thinking. What about just because a person is knowledgeable or a person is an authority on the subject? Well, there's 3 possible options on this one. If you believe somebody based on their authority, because they're a smart figure, because they're a professor, because they're the president, because they're somebody that should be trustworthy, the problems that are associated with this are it could be based on the authority's personal experience, which again brings us back over here, only it's somebody quote unquote trusted as opposed to, or at least in the spotlight, as opposed to your own experience. Or it could be the authority's intuition that's causing this. The only time that we really know an authority can be trusted with what they say, like a lot of us college professors, especially myself, is because it's based on the authority's research and the research that the authority has already looked over and deemed that this is the right things to pass on. Everything else may sound like Trumpisms. But if you believe it based on the research, then you're in a much better space. Now, last time we talked about the research versus journalism. Going to the left side of research, we have those sources that I talked about that have that peer review process vetted really highly, making sure that everything is correct in the way it was done and the way it was interpreted. Journal articles are what we talked about, which could be empirical articles printed the first time with that or replications, and review articles, which basically take a bunch of studies done on the same subject and given an overall review. What does the literature say overall in this topic or category? Chapters in edited books, that could be textbooks. It could be books that have a lot of things to do with maybe psychology or neuroscience. And of course, full-length books that all have to do with one subject. Those have references. Those have citations. You're going to find similarities in all of these. However, what about other sources? There could be sources by psychologists themselves, private books, by journalists, by lay people for popular audiences. Well, again, these are things like trade books. Maybe people are trying to make money off of things. Could be based on their own personal experience or intuition. Magazines and newspaper articles obviously do not have an obligation to stick to the scientific principles. And of course, wiki pages. So you really need to think critically about those. Could they be legitimate sources of information? Absolutely. If, as we talked about at the end of last chapter, if they if they source the citations or cite the sources, that should be the way I should put it. Sorry. Sounds like tongue-tied. If they cite their sources, if the information is clear and you can see where it came from, which usually brings us back to somewhere over here. And wiki pages, of course, those can be interpreted and reinterpreted any way you want. But again, they can be believable, just like not everything on YouTube is BS, if the right sources are cited and you know where the information came from and it's credible. So wiki pages can absolutely have the truth, absolutely be based on science. YouTube videos can as well, just the vast majority, probably not. Think about the popular press versus the actual scientific community. I've spent way too much time on this, so let's break it down. Looking at the research versus your experience. When we got into the end of last chapter, I gave you an example of vaccinations and how a lot of people believe they cause autism because of that idea of correlation does not imply causation. I use that in tandem with the jellyfish stinging you at the beach. One seems believable because it's been shared so many times around the internet and people have these feelings. The other one just seems ridiculous, but they're both pretty close to one another. With experience, you have no comparison group. You, on the left, you can see a game called whackyourboss.com, where you have a chance to beat up your boss because your boss is maybe a jerk. And, you know, what people say is, we don't like our boss. There's been many TV shows and movies and satire based on that. My boss is a jerk. I would like to be able to hit my boss. On the right, we see an experiment based on something that's called the catharsis hypothesis. So this was based on a research study where scientists wanted to know what the best way to deal with anger was. So basically, they put people into 3 treatment groups, unbeknownst to the people, and had them do 3 different things in response to something that made them angry. Well, what made them angry? Let's go over that first. So in this case, remember in research, we have all the groups that are exposed to the same event or the same experience, and there are 3 different ways to be able to deal with it. When you're mad about something in your own experience, you may do nothing, sit quietly. You may go out and punch a punching bag or go get some exercise, let out some steam. Or you could do other things. The thing is that you only do one of those. So there's no comparison group for your experience. What you experienced is the way you experienced it, and you couldn't experience it different. Again, research allows you to look at both sides. People that did study and people that didn't study before the exam. People that sat quietly after something bothered them. People that went and did some aerobic exercise and punched a bag. And then there was a group of people that punched the bag and were told to picture the face of the person who pissed them off, who made them upset, to see how that's done. In this case, we have 3 groups. So there is a comparison group and a couple of different treatments. And we can control for things that you wouldn't be able to control for in your own experience. a lot of things that are done in experiments are done in a controlled lab. So we can do things like control for what it was that made you mad, control for maybe anger issues, and people that get really angry more than normal can be excluded from the study, right? Things like that to make sure that it's the situation and not some other third variable or confounded variable. In this experiment, what they did was they had college students in a political science class, and all of them were to write a paper on political science. And no matter how good or bad their paper was, the TA for that class, who was hired by the researchers, told everybody that their papers were really bad and gave them either, a D or an F. I can't remember which one. Maybe it was just a straight up F. Maybe it was a D. So they could have written brilliant papers. They could have written meh papers. But in the end, all of them were told their papers were basically crap and made them really upset. After they were upset, these groups had one of three experiences. They either sat quietly in the room after he left for about 5 minutes. The second group was told to go out and get some exercise by punching a punching bag, just knowing it was a punching bag and that they were just getting their anger out. And the third group was actually told to picture, oh, by the way, the TA's name was Steve. The third group was told to go to the punching bag and picture that it was Steve's face that they were punching, not that they were just getting out their frustration, but they were targeting Steve's face, picturing Steve's face on the punching bag. And they wanted to see which of these groups would relieve their aggression the most. And so what you see from this graph, and yes, we will be getting better at reading graphs as we go along in this class, because at the end you'll be creating a graph for your experiment. The group that was punching and picturing Steve's face actually had maybe the opposite effect that you'd think, and they actually increased the aggression when they targeted Steve's face. The punching bag group themselves really had no change, so exercising and punching the punching bag didn't really do much to change their aggression. They weren't more aggressive, really, but they weren't less aggressive. It was the people that sat quietly and did nothing for 5 minutes in a dark room and almost like a meditation-like experience. And so what we can see based on the research with comparison groups, controlling for any confounded variables, sitting quietly was the best way to deal with this aggression after getting pissed off because Steve said that your paper sucked. So, in this way, we can see this research is much better than your experience. Back in the 1700s, before medicine was ever modernized, there was no medication. That hadn't been discovered yet. There wasn't enough technology to do a lot. People knew a little bit to try to prevent infections, but there was no antiseptic or anything like that. So what they did was they used a technique with leeches called bloodletting. I was actually talking with someone the other day, and they asked if leeches were still used to sort of suck blood, and I said, well, not in modern medicine, but they're still around in some parts of the world in some places. Anyways, that's not really much of anything. It just reminded me of that. So here in this bloodletting example, somebody would come in and they'd have a sickness that was maybe prolonged, a couple of weeks long, something that was worse than your average cold. And remember, a lot of people at this time could die from the flu because it was harder to treat. And obviously there were no vaccinations then. So we should really be thanking and singing the praises of vaccinations, but I'm not selling them, so it's not that's not my agenda. Just saying that's why polio is no longer a thing. So the person would go in and the doctor would say, well, we need to suck out some of that bad blood. So they'd put leeches on you to suck out some of the blood not all of your blood, because that would kill you. And they would say, hopefully, once the bad blood is out of your system, because the leeches were supposed to take away the bad blood, then hopefully you'll do better. So looking at comparisons, the one thing that they didn't do is take into account all the other times. You really have, as you can see on the right, 4 scenarios here. You can have somebody that was bloodlet and they recovered. You can have somebody that underwent bloodletting and they died. And you can compare them to people who did not have bloodletting. In this case, doctors sang the praises of bloodletting based on the fact that it worked. And that's really all they took into account, is the number of times they did it and the number of times that it worked. So we can look at a baseline comparison if you take all 4 into account. Here on the right, table 2.1, we have a baseline comparison. So here we have to look at all 4 numbers in all 4 categories. We see that there were 20 patients who had bloodletting done and recovered, and we had 80 patients who had bloodletting done and did not recover. So 20 out of 100 gives us a 20% recovery rate. So of the patients that were bloodlet, 20% of them survived. But if we compare them to the ones that weren't bloodlet, and let's say 10 of them where we did no bloodletting recovered, and 40 died, 10 out of 50 is the same percentage. So here, if we were to make a comparison between bloodletting and not bloodletting, we get the same 20% recovery rate, right? In this case, we can look at the numbers and say, well, bloodletting really did nothing. If I did bloodletting, there's a 20% chance of survival. If I did nothing, no bloodletting, there's a 20% chance of survival. So why would I stick leeches on myself or have somebody stick leeches on me if there's no difference? What if we change just one of those boxes? Does that change the outcome of the entire experiment? The answer, well, take a look. If we use the same numbers for bloodletting, 20 survived, 80 did not, that still gives us 20%. But look what happens if we change just one box. It's the box on the bottom right of the number of patients who were not bloodletted and they died. 10 recovered. 1 died. In this case, just changing one box changes the whole outcome. Instead of 10 out of 50, you now have 10 out of 11. That's a 91% survival rate, which means you're much more likely to die from being bloodlet than not being bloodlet. So does this work if we change any of the other boxes or all of the other boxes? Absolutely. If you increase that same box, the value, then you see 20% on the left for bloodletting, and if you change that box to show 10 people recovered and 490 died, that makes it 10, not 10 out of 50, but 10 out of 500. In that case, you only have a 2% survival rate. What that would do to this example is show that being bloodlet gives you 10 times the chances, 10 times higher chances of surviving than of dying, which would really support the idea of bloodletting. The problem with people in this time period is that they didn't take into account the times that it didn't work, or the times that they didn't do anything and it did work. This is where personal experience does not compare, because they don't take that research into account. Here, you have to take all the numbers into account. You have to be empirical. You have to understand when you bloodlet, you have to compare the times people died and survived to the ones that were not bloodlet and the times that they died and survived. The only real way to do the research is to compare all 4 groups. But a lot of times in life, and not just back in the 1700s, people fail to do this. So again, looking at experience, this is why we say it doesn't have a comparison group. If you were a doctor that did bloodletting, you only based it on the times you did it and the times it worked. Doctors probably never even talked about the times it didn't work. And of course, You wouldn't compare it to not bloodletting because you're the bloodletting person. So that's what you're doing. Personal experience does not have a comparison group. Oh, so there's a survival rate of 20% as compared to what? There's no answer for that with personal experience. So look at these survey questions. And this is, again, another time where I'd ask you guys to give me an answer based on this, but I'll do it for you. Here this says, these are basically just research questions from, this one is Ladies Home Journal, LHJ, in 2011, from an article called 6 Weeks to a Younger You. They asked a bunch of women who answered this either online or in the magazine. They wrote in, does volunteering help to keep you young? And what we find is 76% of people who volunteer feel younger than their age. Okay, that sounds kind of nice. It sounds kind of promising. Hey, this makes volunteering sound pretty good. It makes, not only are you contributing to society, but hey, maybe you're going to feel even younger. Well, what about the people who didn't feel younger than their age when they volunteered? And what about the people who don't volunteer? This doesn't really compare to them, right? It doesn't concern them. Well, if you don't volunteer, maybe you're doing things to keep yourself young, like exercising, maybe certain makeups that you wear make you feel younger, or, other things like that. This is very, very biased in that way because you have no comparison group. What about reading the safety guide? If you read the safety guide in the airplane, does that keep you safe? Well, 70% of people who survived air crashes read the in-pocket safety manual before their flight. Interesting. What about the people that didn't survive? First of all, we'll never know. Okay, that sounds a little morbid. I apologize. But what about the people who didn't read the manual and also survived, right? There is a question of, what do we compare this to? It's nice to have numbers like this, but we don't have comparisons. So personal experience does not have a control group. Again, experience is also confounded. Looking at this picture, it reminds me of the study that I just talked about. When we are evaluating our own experiences, we are not able to control for multiple co-occurring effects on our moods or behaviors. When you were mad at Steve for giving you a bad grade, was it because the way that Steve talked to you? Were you hangry and hadn't eaten in a while, maybe had low blood sugar, higher testosterone levels in men, which could make people more aggressive? There's a number of factors. There's some people who, just go through class trying to pass. And so if this one time Steve says, your paper sucked and you got a D, maybe you're like, that's not much worse than usual. Or there's those people that are striving for straight A's. So a D is going to be D for devastating, right? In that case, that may change the way that your anger comes out. So there are always multiple things and effects that we're not taking into account. The beautiful thing about research is that we try to eliminate as many of those things as possible. So again, if I go back to our study on studying, our research on studying versus not studying, we can control the number of hours. We can specifically define how they're studying. We can control for any of these co-occurring effects. Everybody eats at the same time in a perfect experiment, perfectly controlled. Everybody sleeps the same amount, gets a normal 6 to 8 hours of sleep, and not, doing your 6 hours of studying the night before the exam. Nobody gets caffeine. We can control for a lot of these different factors that you can't control for in the real world. So not only does experience not have a control group, but there's multiple things that could be happening. There could be a lot of different things going on when vaccinations are given. The most likely parsimonious response is that it's around the same time that these deficits would automatically appear. So research is better than experience. Again, this study of the effects of catharsis, meaning getting your aggression out, feeling better about it, is a systematic comparison that controls for potential confounds. Um, Getting exercise and just hitting the bag versus picturing Steve's face and keeping that aggression in the forefront of your brain, in your working memory, or sitting quietly and just sort of relaxing and letting go. You can't do this in the real world. You're only going to have one of these reactions. We can control for low blood sugar. We can have everybody eat a meal before they turn in their paper. And we can, control for any other potential confounds or co-occurring events. If it's too hot, we can make sure, some people, I get really cranky when it gets too hot. I need air conditioning to survive. So we can put them in a room that's temperature controlled, right? There are many different things that we can do as good producers of research to be able to eliminate some of those confounds. And of course, by giving people multiple groups, we also have comparison groups to look at the behavior. In this case, 3 different groups. So remember that we talk about research being probabilistic. There may be people who just never get mad at a bad grade, and they go, well, I guess I did kind of suck. Piggybacking on what I said in chapter 1, we never say the word proof. So in research, we talk about it being probabilistic, meaning that it may work for the majority of people. Vaccinations, medications work for the vast majority of people. Studies will find that some people in the group that exercises may feel that that's better for them than just sitting quietly. I know that as a kid, I never had ADHD or ADD or anything like that, but I was, and kind of still am, hard to sit still and just relax. I fidget a little bit, and that's why I like being up and walking about as a professor. That's why it's a good career for me. So these findings are not expected to explain all of the cases. There may be people that felt better after punching what they, pictured as Steve's face than actually sitting still. I would probably be better off myself in the exercise because I can tune everything else out, hitting a punching bag or maybe just going for a run or, ideally for me, playing basketball because that's what helps me to forget the real world, but can't do much of that right now. So there are exceptions. Not everybody's going to like In-N-Out better than Five Guys, and it's okay if you're wrong. So what about your intuition? Why is this faulty, as I started to go over earlier, and now I'm just kind of hammering the point home? Intuition is biased by faulty thinking. In Psych 1, I talk about things like the hindsight bias, where when you already know the outcome, you are fooled into thinking you knew it all along. That's faulty thinking. The reason you feel you knew it all along is because now you already know the answer. So you're like, of course I should have seen the error of my ways. Of course I would have predicted this all along. Well, no, you really became clear. The clarity came in after you already knew the ending. One of the other things is that we also overestimate ourselves. We tend to think that we do better. In social situations, we think we know more. In academic situations, when you're cramming for an exam and you don't sleep the night before, you find that you're like, oh, I kicked butt on that test. I killed it. And then you get your grade back and you're like, why didn't I do as well? Well, sleep is what actually consolidates your memory. So cramming and pulling an all-nighter the night before your exam doesn't give you enough sleep and probably just keeps that information in your short-term memory and doesn't transfer it to your long-term memory. And so what happens is when you're trying to retrieve information, you retrieve it from your long-term memory. That is faulty thinking. The other thing is that people love to put patterns together. And so they think if I'm on a hot streak, or they think that these signs from the universe point to this, this, and this, again, that's faulty thinking. Most of the time, it's based on randomness. It's also biased by a person's motivation. We will see this throughout this class that you may think that you're perfectly legitimate or perfectly balanced. You have a control group, but you also know that in your mind, in your brain, you have a hypothesis. You really want the people who study to do better. There may be, whether you're outwardly motivated for this experiment to work, or whether you're internally and you don't even notice that you're doing this, maybe you're giving hints to somebody. If we did a study on a new antidepressant, right, that's come out on the market and are coming out on the market, and you're the one in charge of doing this study. Well, normally when they do this like clinical trial of medication, what they do is half the people get the drug, let's say it's 25 milligrams of antidepressant. The other group gets a placebo, which is a pill that looks, smells, tastes, feels everything like the original, but it doesn't have any of the medication in it. So it could be that you're handing out this medication, and so only you know which group uh, the people are in. So when you're giving out the real medication with 25 milligrams in it, you go, here you go, here you go. And then when you're giving the placebo that has no medication in it, maybe accidentally, unbeknownst to you, your tone changes and you say, here you go, here's your medication, wink, wink, right? And you're not even realizing that you're doing that. Not only are you giving away which group the people are in, but when they realize that they're in the group that's placebo or not, that may change the way they answer. So your motivation may jeopardize your way of thinking and may jeopardize your experiment. So the intuitive thinker versus a scientific reasoner. The intuitive thinker, says that person is homeless and schizophrenic, and says my intuition is very trustworthy. The scientific reasoner says we need to balance this out and look at all the empirical evidence. So what other types of faulty thinking is there? And this is a lot of times where conspiracy theories come in. There's actually, I can't remember the exact phrase for it, but there is an idea in psychology that the reason why a lot of people believe conspiracy theories is because the truth doesn't have a good conclusion. Whereas conspiracy theories, when they're really well crafted, make for a good story. So a lot of times people are swayed to accept a conclusion just because they feel, well, this makes a lot of sense. So people going around saying that masks are actually more harmful to us than not wearing a mask are believing in a false statement, not based on science, because to them, well, I can't really breathe. And it makes me feel like I'm breathing in my own breath. And so, oh, that must be toxic. Oh, that makes a lot more sense than, wearing a mask around everywhere when it could be killing me. So you're biased by a better story. Conspiracy theories try to come up with reasons why stuff is happening. Do we know why the virus is here? Do we know why, and all these businesses are shut down and all of this? No, but the conspiracy theories that are offered give them some sort of way to connect the dots and give them a good conclusion. That's faulty thinking. A lot of times we also think about, when you're asked to do something, what comes most easily to mind. This is something we call the availability heuristic. Our thinking is guided by what most easily comes to our mind. It's like when somebody says, what's the first thing you think of when you hear the word blank? So whatever comes to your mind first is the answer. Oh, well, of course, everybody knows that. The answer is bananas. Obviously. Well, no, that's just what comes to your mind most easily. Again, with research, we think about all the possible answers and which one makes the most sense, not based on what just comes to the mind most easily. And just like in the bloodletting example, we fail to think of the things we cannot see. I did bloodletting. I see this many patients survive. So I say bloodletting works because I've done it and I've seen it. You focus on positive instances more than the negative ones. This, like the bloodletting example, is something we call the present-present bias. So here is another way of looking at the bloodletting example in a more modern way, based on that other example of research that we saw with catharsis and stupid Steve and his stupid face, right? Here, we look at somebody who was frustrated, and we looked at what they did about it when they were frustrated and how they felt about it after. So here, where it says we're failing to think of the things we cannot see and focusing on positive instances. Well, look, I expressed frustration by yelling, screaming, doing something, maybe punching Steve's face, and it made me feel better. I calmed down. It was a good catharsis. Well, that happened 5 times. The outcome was present and the treatment was present. What about the times you expressed frustration and you actually felt worse? That's actually double the number of times that it made you feel better, and yet only what comes to mind, or you only think about the times when it actually worked. But you would be way off because it's double the amount of times. 10 out of 15 times when you did it, you actually felt worse. What about the times where you did nothing and you felt better? You just sat quietly or you just kind of let it go? That 10 times. So not only more times than you expressed frustration and felt better, double the amount of times when you did nothing and you felt better. That's absent present. And what about here? When you felt worse after doing nothing was only half the time. In fact, the same number of times that you did something and felt better is the same number of times that you did nothing and felt worse. So the only thing, the availability heuristic or the present-present bias, right? The only thing that comes to mind is the times you did it and the times you felt better about it. But again, in order for us to really understand what's happening, we need to take all of the evidence into account. By doing this, you're just as likely to feel worse by expressing frustration as you are likely to feel a lot better if you do nothing. So in this case, we have a control group, what happens when you did nothing, and we take into account all the evidence, not just present. The availability heuristic also can be thought of when you go to we'll talk about, since in chapter 1 we talked about buying a new car, you went and got a new blue car because you like blue. A nice Bruin blue, because that Trojan nasty colors, no, we don't, it looks like McDonald's. Anyways, so go Bruins. You go and buy your car, and then you drive out onto the freeway, and all of a sudden, whoa, look at the amount of blue cars that there are on the highway. I never knew there were so many blue cars. Well, there's probably always been about the same amount of blue cars as you're driving down the freeway. But now, because you just bought a blue car, it's what comes most easily to mind, and it's what you guys and gals pick up on as you're driving home in your new blue car, right? That is another example of the availability heuristic. So again, in the present-present bias, you're looking at only 1/4 of the equation, the times you did something and the times you felt better. It's like going to debates and a person is horribly bad the whole time, but one of the questions, one time out of the whole thing, they get an answer right, and maybe it's a better answer than their opponent. Again, I doubt this is true for Trump, but let's just say there was one thing that really was nailed. Everything else was horribly off, horribly wrong, lies, completely off topic, right? People on Fox News or whoever are going to concentrate on that one thing and say, he destroyed his opponent because look at what he did here. All you're doing is taking into account the one time where he got things right and maybe even had a better answer, and not looking at everything else and basing your opinion of the whole thing based on that. Another example of the present-present bias. Intuition is, of course, also biased by motivation. A lot of times, and this is where I'll get to the anti-vaccination part, we focus on the evidence that we like the best because it fits our narrative and it fits our agenda. So we only seek and accept only the evidence that supports what we already think. A lot of people use the original study of vaccinations have a link to autism because there was a study that showed definitive proof, and this is when they become scientists. The study was published in about 1996 by Dr. Andrew Wakefield from the UK. The problem with this is that he came out later and said that there was an agenda, that the company that he got funded by had an agenda, and that he basically made up the data. Also, I would like to point out on the scientific side, this data was based on 12 people. Now, when you see these clinical trials and all the vaccinations for COVID going on and all of that stuff, it's based on hundreds of cases at least. If they're really efficient, thousands of cases. This was based on 12 cases, and he said there was a link to from vaccinations to autism, that it can actually change your genetic structure and give you autism. Then he came out later and it was denied. But yet, a lot of people, even though this was debunked, he lost his medical license for life, is never allowed to practice medicine again. People still use this study as proof. Again, we don't like the word proof, but they do. Proof that vaccinations cause autism. There was a study that came out about 3 years ago based on over 95,000 people that showed no link between vaccinations and autism. Again, I point to that wonderful phrase, correlation does not imply causation. But if it fits your narrative, even though it was debunked, people don't care. They're going to stick to that. We have the authority figure of, which I'll get to next, of Jenny McCarthy, right? And because she is a celebrity of sorts, she is a voice of authority, and her personal experience says, I gave my son a vaccination, and my son then developed autism after the fact. Correlation does not imply causation. Allergic reactions, sure. Does it cause your genetic structure to change based on the ingredients in the vaccination? Absolutely not. Sorry about it. What about asking biased questions? Well, when you ask biased questions, you're doing that to get expected answers. We ask the questions that are more likely to get the answers we desire. Well, can you explain it? No, well, there it is. Proof that you can't explain it, science. So it's got to be the way that I see it. And of course, being biased about being biased. Well, I did my research, and this is what I came up with, clearly and definitively. There are so many other studies that are done in an actual scientific, empirical manner that show no link. Another study came out last year, which again shows thousands and thousands of people that there is no link, zero link between vaccinations like the measles, mumps, rubella, MMR, and autism. So, you may also say, well, you scientific people aren't looking at all the evidence. You're only looking at the evidence that agrees with you. No, we're looking at the empirical evidence that's actually done correctly. So they're seeing the bias in others, but of course not themselves. Everybody's guilty except for me. So they're biased about being biased. So when we look at the intuitive thinker based on intuition versus scientific reasoning, we always make mistakes when we're basing our reasoning on intuition rather than on all the evidence and science. Researchers create comparison groups. Researchers eliminate as many of the confounds as they can in their design. That's being a good producer of research. And researchers don't just look at one box when there's 4. They look at all the data, all the comparisons. They don't fall prey to the present bias or the availability heuristic because they take the time and energy and effort to look at all of it empirically and then make their decision based on that. The intuitive thinker, intuition is a shortcut, intuition is faulty, and this is why we need scientific reasoning in psychology and all across science. What about trusting authorities? I gave you a couple examples of Trump. I gave you Jenny McCarthy. I can give you things like, people speaking out on political issues like LeBron James and the opposition telling him to just shut up and dribble. And then when they don't dribble, they get opposition as well. So who to trust? What authorities can you trust in this case? Well, back to this sort of map. Down here, based on authority, up here, based on authority, it could be the authority's research. If that's the case, you know that it's safe because the numbers, the sources, the citations are all there. But it could be the authority's personal experience, and that brings us back to here, or the authority's intuition, and that brings us back to here. So you really need to use your critical thinking skills to understand where their information is coming from. Bottom line, research is better. Really quickly going back, right? Again, using that idea of we can trust journalists if they cite it directly. If not, we may need to, like the scientists, dig a little deeper in magazines and newspaper articles, in internet blogs, and things like that, because we don't want it to turn into that game of telephone where grandma is wearing a tinfoil hat so she doesn't get A. Obviously, research is better. So how do we conduct the research? Well, let's see. And after this, it would be a good idea to go over the assignment for the end of this week by Sunday night, which is to look up research in the library database. And I have a separate assignment and a separate tutorial on how to do that. So how do we find and read the research? Can we just simply Google it? Sometimes. There is a website via Google called Google Scholar, which actually links all of the scientific journals that are available in the Google database. We want to consult scientific sources, find scientific sources, and then figure out how to read the research and understand what it actually means. We also want to know in less scholarly places if they actually base it on the research or if it's just sort of a summary and not really based on the actual research. So, going back and zooming in on this part, scientific sources in psychological research by psychologists for other psychologists, and hopefully for the rest of the world to understand. But of course, it's very convoluted and wordy and complex. And so sometimes journalists can make it a little more simple for the layman, put it in a way that is understandable. But the problem is that they don't always do that, or they make conclusions that really aren't there. And that can turn into a big mess. Journal articles, again, empirical articles, which is what we are focusing on in this course, and review articles, which takes into account all of the articles or all of the papers that have been published in a certain topic and gives an overall review of what the evidence says overall. Chapters and edited books and full-length books on the subject are also based on research and empirical data, and in this boldness can be trusted for the most part. Here, you have to use critical thinking. Trade books, if they have the references, sure. Magazines and newspaper articles, if they accurately portray the numbers and they show links or citations to the actual research that was done, it can take you back to here so you can find it for yourself and make sure that they're telling the truth. And of course, wiki pages, a lot of times on the bottom, do have citations, sources, and links. A lot of times they don't, and those are the ones that can definitely not be trusted unless you go back and check it out yourself. maybe it's based on something like this and they didn't cite it. The responsible ones will. So, journal articles are, of course, psychology's most important source. We talked about empirical versus review articles, and here are some of the journals. I'm just going to go over them. Clinical psychology has behavioral therapy, cognitive therapy, counseling psychologists, Journal of Abnormal Psychology, blah, blah, blah. We have applied psychology, Journal of Applied Psychology. Remember, these are very specific types of treatments and things like that, like the prosthetics in Chapter 1. The applied psychology is once the basic research has already been discovered, we're looking to apply it to something specific. Educational psychology, experimental psychology applied, all of these things. Cognitive psychology, Journal of Experimental Psychology, Perception and Performance. Personality and social psychology journals, Journal of Research and Personality. Developmental, child development, psychology and aging. Neuroscience, of course, behavioral neuroscience, developmental psychobiology, nature neuroscience, which is probably the gold standard here. And journals that contain review articles could be ones that show, again, the overall presence of what these articles say. Psychological Bulletin, American Psychologists, that review a whole bunch of different articles on the same topics. And spanning several topics. It could be, a cornucopia, if you will, of different things. Oops. So, psychological science, psychological methods, Journal of Social Issues, the emotion could be a bunch of different topics in the same journal. Books, you either have full-length books or chapters and edited books. Obviously, different chapters for different sections in this book and most textbooks and journals. Journals like hardback, like Journal of Abnormal Psychology, things like that could be considered both. That would most likely be a journal, but most of these textbooks and maybe self-help books and things like that, full-length books that cite the material, evidence-based treatments, cited sources from experiments. Those are the ones that we don't have to worry about if the information is false, because they go through and reference a lot of these studies that were done, like the textbook that we have right now. And so you can believe, because again, it's gone through that rigorous process. Reading scientific sources. When you are reading and digesting an article, and don't worry, for this first assignment, you do not have to read and understand what the article is saying. We will have plenty of time for that, as this is only week 1. But when you're looking through this, the different sections of a paper, which I'll introduce to you now, and then we'll go through them individually as we go throughout this course, is looking at what the article is saying. There may be a lot of confusion, the way that it's worded, the terminology that they use, the way it's written, all of that stuff. So the guiding questions that you want throughout the entire paper is, what is the argument they're trying to make, and what is the evidence they found? Here in the Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin, we see the beginning of the paper, which is that catharsis study in 2002 by Bushman. Does venting anger feed or extinguish the flame? Catharsis, which means feeling better afterwards. Rumination, which would be excessive thinking about it, overthinking. Distraction, anger, and aggressive responding. So what we're first going to find in a journal article, and you guys may have had some experience or a lot of experience with journal articles before this class. Some of you may have had almost zero or none at all experience with it. So when you first get an article like this, you're going to find an abstract, which is basically a beefier paragraph that gives an entire summary of all of the other sections, except for the references, and gives you an overall view. When you go into a journal database, you're going to find that your search is going to come up with the abstract so that you can read basically a one big paragraph version of the paper to see if maybe it's something that you want to look at or not specifically. So it gives you a little bit about the background of the paper, which is in the introduction. The introduction introduces the topic itself and lists some of the studies that have been done that I talked about in chapter 1, where we look at the evidence of what was done before your current experiment. The method section, which tells exactly how you did it in a step-by-step fashion, which we'll be focusing on for our first paper. The results section, which tells you, based on the data collected, did we get what we hypothesized? And the discussion, which is the why. If we got what we wanted, if we find that studying causes people to do better in class, why do we think this is? If sitting in a quiet room and decompressing for 5 minutes was the best way to deal with anger and aggression, why do we think this was? What does this mean for the field of psychology as a whole? Were there any things in this study that were done that we could have done better? Right? That's in the discussion section. And then the references give you all of the citations and all of the previous research that you put into this paper in a way that you can look it up yourself and see what those other ones do. So these are the main sections of an empirical article, and these are the sections that you're going to concentrate on for your manuscript. So when you're reading the article, you're asking yourself, what's the argument? That there are better ways to deal with anger than others, maybe? What's the evidence to support this? Looking at that graph and going through and looking at the results, people felt less angry and, felt better overwhelmingly by sitting in a room as opposed to hitting a punching bag or picturing Steve's stupid face. When you look at chapters and review articles, you're asking yourself for the same thing. You're taking all of this information, whether it's one study or whether it's a collection of different studies, to make one point. What's the argument? What's the evidence? Can I believe it? So all of these different types of research, you're approaching with the same method and the same ideas and the same main questions. Finally, looking in less scholarly places, the retail bookshelf, the popular press, which can be disastrous sometimes or can be spot on sometimes, and of course wikis at your own risk. If they actually give the citations and the information from the article where you could easily look it up yourself, then they can be believed. If not, it's a little harder to be able to believe it. So again, this I believe based on experience, no comparison group, confounds, not a great idea. Based on intuition, that's biased by faulty thinking and biased by a person's motivation, or both. Based on a person's authority, if they're an expert and they show research and give the numbers and the citations and the sources, great. Otherwise, it could just be based on the authority's personal experience. Vaccinations cause autism, jellyfish, don't go to the beach, you'll get stung by a jellyfish. Or the authority's intuition, which brings us back to here. Or it can be based on research. If it's a scientific source, you should be able to believe it, at least until it's comes out that the scientist or researcher was complete BS. If it's in other sources, you may be able to find some of these things that are here and are able to believe it. If not, it's a little bit harder, so maybe you don't believe it or you dig a little deeper. And again, that makes you a good consumer of research. You don't necessarily have to be the producer of research to be able to do that. You can do this now before we learn the skills and understand all of the tools to make our own experiments. This has been a fun chapter to go over. After this, you should be able to go to the first assignment, which will be due this weekend, which is to log on to the ELAC database, library database, and find a journal article that has to do with psychology, or maybe go on Google Scholar. With that first assignment, I have included a tutorial which will explain how to get onto the ELAC website and how to go on Google Scholar and what the pros and cons of each one is. Basically, I just want you to spend a good 10-15 minutes searching through and just basically picking an article, downloading it, and then entering it in to the Canvas page as your first assignment to get credit for this, just to show that you're able to search the literature and you understand what you're doing. And as usual, I'll talk to you guys soon.